Welcome to Mind, Crime, Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're again joined by Rik Storey to discuss the sexual ethics of a post-Christian society. What are the sexual ethics of Christianity? What is its views on marriage? What is marriage like today? What should we think about Jeffrey Epstein? What should we think about the age of marriage? These are the kind of things we hope we'll get onto today. So, Tim, open us up, please.
So before we talk about the sexual ethics, I'll just make a quick aside about ethics. This isn't the topic of the discussion, but I think it's a point need to be brought up. Ethics definition from our friends at Google, our very close friends at Google, which I think the definition is perfectly fine, is the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conduct of activity or the branch of knowledge that deals with moral principles. In both cases, I think that is the ultimate grounding is probably Christianity or some sort of religion. I think most, if you ask a sociologist or anthropologist and they're being somewhat honest, that would be the case. That'd be some sort of religion or some sort of philosophy in that regard. So this isn't really a discussion of what grounds ethics. And even the Randians, they should have some sort of meta-ethical position. You could say, well, hypotheticals, imperatives. So that's not really a discussion. So we'll just sort of assume that ethics exist. There's such thing as a good. Now that's partly in the debate, but nonetheless, since this is the West here and the historical heritage of the West, and still probably the dominant culture or its heresies is Christianity. So before we get into like the post-Christian and the current age, which we're entering, whether or not a post-Christian society will actually be particularly stable is of some question. But I think we'll start here. What is the sexual ethics of Christianity itself? Is Christianity anti-sex and anti-family? So both Paul and Christ, the two big figures in Christianity, arguably, are both single, in particularly when they're in their ministry. And there seems to be a sort of two strains of evidence, two strains of thought in Christianity. You have the procreation, fill the earth, but you also have the line that Slavoj Žižek always like to bring up, that you must hate your mother, sister, brother. And there's also a book on Paul that sort of views him as both a feminist and a patriarch, a patriarchist or something, whatever word you want to say. And then it's got to be a feature or a bug depending on one's viewpoint. And you do get weird Christian sects like the Oneida group, which had basically polygamy it was basically remembers what Plato envisions in the Republic, where you just have communal ownership and of not only women but to some extent men and children. So you get sort of weird derivations, but they're only weird in some sense. And actually, the late Greeks and the late Romans had all sorts of strange behavior based on modern standards, and as people like Marxists would argue, is that traditional Marxists tended to be rather conservative when it comes to sexual ethics, and even using certain things like homosexuality as decadent bourgeois behavior. So I'll open up here with Rik. So so far I made a few comments about meta-ethics. That's not really a discussion, but what do you make of it? Is Christianity anti-sex and anti-family, or is it pro-family? You get the Song of Songs, and you get the but then again, Paul talks about accommodation. So Rik, what do you think?
Well, very good questions, Tim. Now, you have to be forgiven for asking such a question, even though, you could look at not just Catholic families, but also many Protestants who have large numbers of children. You still have to be forgiven for asking, is Christianity anti-sex? Because this is a charge that is brought against it by not just those who are more atheistically inclined. There would be Muslim apologists who would bring a charge like this against Christianity, and others. And the reason is precisely as you said. Paul and Christ, and obviously a number of other early church figures, of course, left aside any concerns for marriage, starting a family, and they devoted their lives, they devoted all of their energy to their ministry and to spreading the gospel and to ultimately what they saw as, serving God. And this is, of course, where we have monastic orders, where individuals will be considered to be married to God in a certain sense, and devoting their lives to good works and obviously to prayer most significantly. And this has, of course, started a number of different sects. I have to be careful how I pronounce that one on this topic, which were Gnostic. Everyone's familiar with the different Gnostic sects within Christianity, which were very wary, let's just say, of the material world. And to the extent that they would be quite ascetic and have very negative views about material appetites, bodily appetites, shall we say, including, of course, the urge for sex, for procreation. Nevertheless, what we can most definitely say is that although Christ and Paul dedicated their lives to God and spoke very highly of setting aside any desire to marry and to live a celibate life serving God, nevertheless, the attitude of Christianity is that the material world is not evil. Sex, and even the enjoyment of sex, is not evil either. No more than, let's say, fire is. Fire, of course, can be something very dangerous if it's not in its right place, but controlled and in the right place and in the hearth. It's the center of the home. It is life-giving. It's of tremendous importance and of great spiritual significance. And so, a very similar attitude towards sex is there. And, Christians themselves would be, far from the first ones to point out that even within the dimensions and certain designs of the aesthetics of cathedrals even, there are things that strongly would, represent even the sexual organs of a woman. It's often pointed out that the archway and the doors to the cathedral, or certain aspects of the altar space, are quite representative of sex organs. Now, this is actually by design. These things are seen as a place where spiritual life is, and so especially within Catholic aesthetics, and especially Italian aesthetics, the human form, and yes, even sex organs and all of that, it's not seen as anything to necessarily shy away from. It's just something that needs to be in its proper place. It's not something that is ugly, or cannot be beautiful, cannot be a celebration of the divine or of the goodness of God. Really, the key thing to bear in mind, it's really very simple. After all that I've just said, it's really very simple. What you have to bear in mind when you think about Christian sexual ethics is that these four things must stand together, and they can't be separated one from any of the others. So that would be love and marriage, like the song, and of course sex and procreation. Love, marriage, the act of sex, and procreation. In principle, those four things must not be separate. None of them must be separated out from the others. If you have all of them together, what you will have is the basis of the nuclear family, which is the fundamental building block of higher civilization. And if any of these things are to be removed, it will ultimately lead to degenerations of some kind or another, which will threaten the sustainability of civilization and of the individual's human life even. It can cause tremendous problems and pain, and ultimately separation from God, who is love, who is goodness itself. So I know I've waffled on a bit there, but as much as possible, in a nutshell, it's those four principles together. That's the Christian sexual ethic.
I would largely agree with Rik, just on the sort of historical points on Paul. There is a stream of thought that says Paul was married at one point and he was probably a widower. Secondly, the passage in which he seems to argue that marriage is an accommodation, seems to be in a very specific context that they should be like him and not marry, probably due to, it's not clear what exactly. There's these various interpretations, and I don't remember which ones they are, but there seems to be some sort of persecution that's going to take place in that time. And basically his point is that it would be better to be without children and a wife at this time, basically. So I think Paul is sort of misread as being more ascetic than he is. It is true you do get the ascetics in the early centuries, and also monasticism, which does have some merit, although to what extent monasticism is a good idea or not seems to be a somewhat interdenominational dispute, which we won't go into. But I think Rik's statement largely is accurate. Tim?
I'm going to somewhat push back and somewhat move on to the next question. One of the things that Christianity does, for better or for worse, is it raises the position of both women and children. I have nothing against this. The classical liberals have nothing against Mises, Sean Gebb. They have nothing against this per se. And this is actually to a large extent, a strength of sort of historical Western Christian society, a very child-centric society in a lot of ways. But this is the early church went after infanticide. But this, as Unwin points out in his book on his anthropologist, this has raised the status. And you get this sort of in sort of reactionary critiques of Christianity that says that Christianity is sort of the cause of feminism to a certain extent. And again, to what extent what it is, it depends on that. But it clearly raises the position of women and children. And in the old Roman system, they were basically all the property of the father, including the sons as well. So in that regard, I mean, you could argue that if you think you could argue that it's a perverse system, and arguably it is. Most people today, not just particularly the left, who oftentimes critiques Christianity for being patriarchy, would argue that the Roman system was much worse, and I would tend to agree with them in that regard. But if your goal is to create family on that grounds, maybe that's not goal is Christianity. So what do you make about the raising of the status of children and women? Now, does that end up into some Gloria Steinem, type scenario we have today, where they have my body, my choice? Who knows? But I do think you could crack some line into there, whether how strong that is or whether how much people would agree with that. So I'll start, Rik, with that question. To what extent is the raising of children and women, as I stated, it's largely a positive, especially if the children no more infanticide and so forth. Rik?
Well, certainly, I think it's unarguable that Christianity did raise the status of children and women in a very specific sense. So you're quite right. In the Roman system, you had the paterfamilias. The father was the head of the household, but there was also a very strongly religious aspect to this as well. As the head of the household, he was the one who maintained the household fire in the hearth, and therefore he was the one who had communion with the ancestors, and this would pass on to his eldest son. And so the household had a very religious aspect to it, and the father in the household was, even under Roman law, quite a tyrant. And now this, of course, led to instances where fathers were brutal. They brutalized their family, their women and their wives and their children. They could treat them as their own property, and they could abuse that property. That very word brutalize comes from a Roman figure who indeed executed his sons when he became suspicious that they may have betrayed him. And of course, he was free to do so. So where Christianity entered, this was then to say, well, hold on a moment, a woman and a child have their own individual soul, and so they are ultimately responsible for their own actions before God. And they are also made in the image of God. They have their own life to lead as well. So yes, it desired to preserve the order of the father in the home. However, as with everything, one's property, one's family, these are things that have been given. They are gifts from God, and we are simply stewards in this life to use our property and to nurture those around us, even our neighbours, toward the common good. And so this simply would not do, to be abusing your own family in this way. And one of the significant aspects of this was that women, of course, women were able to make an oath, the marital oath. They were able to decide ultimately at the altar before the priest whether they would agree, whether they would say, I do, to marry a certain man. They could, of course, refuse. Now, that whether the social politics would really allow them to, whether they were coerced in some instances or not, that's a separate matter. Nevertheless, this was a huge step forward. And what was the other thing I was about to say? Yes. So also women could go to a court, a church court. They suddenly had legal recourse against their husband if their husband became a brute. And so women and children, now had a certain safety mechanism to prevent men from abusing their family. In the same way that Christianized Rome and the Christianized West would also seek to prevent misuses of property, contrary to the common good as well. A good book that I would recommend to listeners on this is a book called Inventing the Individual by Larry Siedentop. I've basically stolen everything I've just said from that book, but for further reading on the matter, I would recommend that one.
I think that's, again, largely true, although I would say, especially on the theological aspects of the soul of children and women, the paterfamilias did decrease in its power, at least according to J.D. Unwin, from the time of the Roman Republic to the Empire. And so the control of the father and his household did diminish somewhat over those time periods. And also there were certain periods, say in the Greek times, in which women of wives of aristocrats actually had a significant amount of power, even if it wasn't. Now, I'm not sure how the Greek system worked, but certainly they weren't sort of having modern rights as feminists, as it were. So much so, I think, from a variety of readings, Solon is apparently to have put a law in place to basically restrict how much money women were spending on clothes and other things because they were wasting their husband's money. So they can't have had too little power in such circumstances. Although I would say it is largely true, although I do think the classical periods are a little, they were like that for times, but not all of the times. That's why I'd nuance there, really. Tim?
To the extent the classical period is like that, I would in general take the position that the Greeks are, especially with Thomas Aquinas and Augustine for taking, Greek thinkers and mixing them theologically. So I'd argue they're to a large extent heirs of our society. I've said this before. I mean, we're not heirs from Aztecs. The buildings in the United States, the buildings in Washington D.C. are not modeled after them. They're modeled after Roman buildings, or Greek buildings, actually, to be precise. So So in that regard, I think they're sort of closely correlated on as far as theologically. So I do think there's a big influence on Greek thought. Now people like Tertullian and others, might disavow we'll have Jerusalem in common with Athens and so forth. So maybe the influence of Greeks is unwarranted there. But nonetheless, I do generally agree with you, both of you, to a large extent. But I think at times the reactionaries who make the critic that Christianity creed that have some amount of truth, and it does develop in that way as a stepping stone. You climb up a building, you throw the ladder away, and then you get to a new height. That ladder might have had some usage there, but we see this sort of down. I think the term is unloading. Certain institutions, and you even get this. Recently, Thaddeus Russell was interviewing, I think I want to say his name right, Daniel McCarthy of TAC, and Thaddeus was asking, like, is Burke a creeping, is Burke a closeted postmodernist like him? Because if you just keep changing things generation over generation, if you just keep doing gradual changes, eventually you can end up with that. And I think there's a point to make, but the quick way to distinguish is that, well, that's clearly not the case, and that to a large extent I think extinguishes it. Although natural law or something that could actually come up, like you get this sort of, the groups that produce the most children will in the end fill the earth. So that actually might be the decider. That's sort of like, it's almost a proto-Darwinian idea, although the Darwinians would always poo-poo anyone who said that. But we've largely moved out of Christianity to that. So I'm going to move on to the next part here. And as far as the actual mechanics of it, of the rules, laws, or mores surrounding it. So what ought to be the legal age of marriage? And for that matter, sex. This Walter Block sometimes gets parodied for this. He always brings up this. I love this continuum problem he has. You take an 18-year-old, you minus 1 day. Okay, 17 years, 364 days. If someone has, if an adult male, or occasionally it does happen the other way around, as people like Milo Annapolis happens. If someone has, sexual relations with that 17-year-old, 364 day, they're a statutory rapist. Now you can keep doing this sort of continuum problem of subtracting 1 day or even 1 minute, and you end up with a 10-year-old. So this is the nature of continuum problems. Like, now you could root it in biology, but everyone's biology is a little different. People become functional at different ages. And then this is again where Christianity, from my understanding, like when the British Empire went into India, people like to bring up the baggage of the British Empire. But nonetheless, I think there are a lot more perverse sexual relations that existed in Roman systems, or sort of a parody of the Christian system that you could generate. It is true that So what exactly ought to be the age then of marriage? And then, as Rik pointed out, the I do, the voluntary. Now you could say that sex should all occur in marriage. One could argue that as well. So those are I'm going to start off here with Rik here. So what do you make of the continuum problem and sort of the legal, the sort of legal framework around there? And then what do you make of the, in general, the age of consent in that regard? And should sex occur outside of it? Is the Bible actually condone sex out there? It does condone fornication of some variety. I'm well aware of that. So, Rik.
Well, again, I would look at this through the lens of the Christian ethics, where we have those four things that have to be held together: love, marriage, sex, and procreation. Now, I'm very familiar with cultures around the world where a girl will be of the age of perhaps say 11 years old, and she'll have her first period, and they will say, you've become a woman now. The reason they're saying it, obviously, it's very clear to us is that we learned that from that point, she is now technically capable of procreation. If the act of sex occurs, and then there is a chance that yes, she will fall pregnant. Now, I think we have to be careful here, because this does not necessarily mean that it is appropriate in different contexts around the world for girls of the age of 11 or even the age of 9, perhaps, where girls could perhaps have their first period, for them to then be engaging in the act of sex and then opening them up to potentially becoming pregnant and to giving birth, and then to having the duties of a mother thrust upon them. Why not? Well, again, love has to be in the equation here. Love, marriage, as well as sex and procreation. There's tremendous responsibility that would be put upon this girl. We would use that term girl in our Western context, if she were to become a mother. And so certainly what we would perhaps ideally want is for her to then at least be married, so that there would be some protective caretaker, a husband, typically in her life, to enable her to be able to care for the child properly and to devote the proper time, attention, energy, and emotion to that baby. Now, if we're to say, well, okay, that's fair enough. You want to be loving towards this person. Well, couldn't all of that still be in place at the age of 11? Well, think about, for instance, the context of early Victorian period. Now, people had been enculturated and perhaps evolved in a certain extent to the point where girls were having their periods really very late, even up to their late teens, sometimes as late as perhaps 17, 18 years old. This was when they were becoming women, as it's described in certain other cultures. Now, we've settled on this age of 18 as when one is an adult, and in the UK, my own context, the age of consent for sexual relations is 16. Those are the ages that we've just settled on, and we've just not quite so arbitrarily, but just decided upon. Does this mean that, in an American context, where I understand, the age of consent is a bit different, but, if a girl is 17, that she is totally a child, she's completely incapable of making any of these sorts of decisions for herself, she doesn't really know what she's doing, she doesn't know what she's getting herself in for. Does it necessarily mean that? Well, no, we understand, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. I do think that we need to look at the cultural context that we're talking about. We need to understand generally, where are the people at? Because, as I've just explained, girls can go through puberty and have their first period at different stages in their life, depending on what context we're talking about. And I think that part of the equation where we have love there, I think it's to understand that the parents of this girl, woman, have to understand where she is at in her life. This man who were to come along and be some kind of suitor, some marital prospect, he has to determine whether it is in the best interest of this person to get into a marital relationship with them, to be having sex and potentially to be procreating and presenting this woman with the duties of motherhood. Is it really in their best interest? Again, what the Christian ethic is very wary of is at any point to simply be making a sexual object out of the girl/woman. Yes, I think I'll leave it there. But I think adding love into the equation is very important in order to understand how the Christian ethic is to be applied across different cultural contexts.
I would agree. The love aspect is very important, as it were, in a more ideal way that marriage and sex would or should work. My approach is slightly different. I think it's an interesting question on the legality rather than primarily on sort of the ideal situation, because you do have odd cases. To some extent, you get the claims that Jeffrey Epstein is a paedophile, for example, which, given at least the type of girl who was on his island, seems not to be particularly accurate. So, for instance, the other cultures around the world, we said girls can get married after their first period. At least sort of procreation is in principle possible at that point, and so that kind of makes to some extent some sense as a marital age or an age of consent to some extent. Whereas before then it clearly doesn't. I think the term sort of paedophile is used far too broadly. I think paedophilia, understood correctly, is best used to describe those who cannot in principle procreate. So that's boys before certain functional abilities, and the same for the girls. Jeffrey Epstein to some extent would seem to be an ephebophile, which is attracted to, I can't remember the exact definition. It's sort of adolescent. It's sort of mature to some extent, but not necessarily entirely physically, but certainly beyond the point of, at least at the point of procreative ability. So I was thinking, what sort of consistent standard could one use for marital age? And I came to the view that whilst it's true that in certain cultures you take the age of which first period, and that kind of makes some form of sense, biologically speaking, it's almost certainly going to be particularly bad to have a child at that age, because the rest of the body is not fully mature. I think probably a better criterion would be sort of, we should call it sexual maturity, maybe a good idea. So, you get the hips out to that sort of the adult size, full breast development, etc. That would seem to be a reasonable criterion to use. Now, of course, you may have some as a presumption. Obviously, there may be mental aspects there which are not fully formed. But as a go-to, you might assume if you're bodily mature, then you are mentally mature, at least from a legal standpoint. I think would be a reasonable criteria. And so I think in the UK's context, 16 is reasonable. In others, in America, even though you're saying there's a child at 17, in the South, back in 60 or before the war, some girls got married at 14, and until relatively recently, the earliest marriage age in Spain was 14. So taking a particular age is to some extent arbitrary. And I think that would be a better criterion. And let's say with the Jeffrey Epstein stuff, I mean, the girls, inverted commas, who were there seem to be maybe there's massive naive, but I think some of them would know exactly what was going on, and they seem to like all the stuff that was thrown at them while they were there. This isn't to say Jeffrey Epstein is a good guy, but just to describe what I think most accurately is the perceptions of those involved to a large extent. Now, I'm no expert, I could be wrong, but that would be my broad take on sort of age of marriage. Tim?
one thing related to Epstein, which I think needs to be brought up here, which is actually Christianity, which the impulse, I can't think of the word, but the idea of having a permanent marriage in a way, I think anyone takes this, is in a way equalizes the marketplace to a certain extent, because you get high status men divorcing their wives or just finding younger models, so to speak. So in this regard, marriage in a way harms men, harms high status men later on, it does put them it does put women possibly into a less. So there's certain ways in which Christianity has raised the status by not having divorce, or not having divorce in a sort of for frivolous reasons, or reasons to sort of get a different model. So and this is again a sort of, you can make this sort of like a masculinist critique of Christian marriage rules. You have to say marry the same woman all the day. That's a problem if you're an extremely high status aristocratic or male or something like that. It's a more monogamous, the iron rule of monogamy, so to speak. That's the word I'm trying to think of. So in that regard, the Jeffrey Epstein was clearly, there are all sorts of, high status, wealthy men. Now there could be blackmail accusations there too. But I mean, you could argue this is just like, and the women clearly got, I'm well aware there are air quote prostitute women that are in bad situations. You don't need to remind me of that. But it's quite clear that some of them are choosing in theory. And this also shows up in, interestingly, like libertarian debates over the legalization of prostitution. As you get strange coalitions of people forming. You have feminists who are against prostitution for what I would argue are purely Christian reasons. And if you just start reading some, reactionary critiques of Christianity, I would argue they are Christian reasons. I think the Social Democrats, I don't, whether you take a figure like, left-wing Christian like Cornel West, yes, and do you support people paying for sex? I think he would clearly say no. You can hate Cornel West or dislike him for whatever other reasons, but nonetheless, I think there's a certain extent which, on legalization of prostitution, that shows up. Of course, interestingly, Thomas Aquinas was for the, he viewed it as a vice, but you shouldn't go after. As a libertarian, then I'm very suspicious of the state labeling anything as. I'm very suspicious of the state labeling anything, and I to some extent experience this myself. I mean, the current state probably views, classically, even 100 years ago, if you let your kids walk to school by themselves, the state's not going to call you a child abuser. But now you might be able to do, or if you do dangerous sports, like archery or certain forms of climbing, I think it's perfectly reasonable to let kids do those things. But if you're this nanny state, less so. So I'm very suspicious of that. So I'm going to pass this question over to you, Rick. And it's sort of a hybrid of a question. But you see this show up in libertarian circles and sometimes conservative, which I think you're much more sympathetic, if not an outright one. I'll make this, critique of the legalization of prostitution, legalization of that. So it seems like what Jeffrey Epstein is doing, he's running a high-class brothel. Really, that to me is really what it seems like doing. There are probably people there against their will. But this is again where Christianity, for all the critiques made at divorce, in a way, keeps the genie in the bottle, so to speak. The alternatives are probably much worse, and so forth. So, Rick, what do you make of my comments regarding that? Are they to an extent true?
Well, I would largely agree with most of what you said there, Tim. Particularly, I like where you said that, and I would add to the list actually that the left and various other folks who don't even realize it, they're actually applying Christian ethics when they're developing, various ideas about things. They're so enculturated into Christian ethics, as we all are in the West. and throughout Europe and into Russia, etc. And also these things are very intuitive. There is a reason why Christianity teaches these things. It's because we feel these things. We have a sense of these things being wrong, and they don't work with the natural order of things. When things are thrown out of balance and they negatively affect the family, and the fabric of society itself seems to fall apart. And as well as, of course, these things being taught in Scripture, having been revealed to us and nailed down. There is also a place for the traditional feeling one's way through these things, working through issues over the centuries. And yes, I mean, these are the ethics that we have to apply. What I also liked what you said there, Tim, and I think really, for me, the way I see it, this is the crux of the problem here. You said that men might trade in their woman for a younger model, their wife even, divorce them, so break the vow that they made, until death do them part, and then to trade them in for a younger model. Now, that's a term, of course, we would use for a car. It is a wife, someone that we befriend ultimately, and set out on a journey through our lives to raise a family, and to do good by each other. Is that the same as buying a car? Instinctively, we know it is simply not. This is not how we behave. We do not live our everyday lives treating each other as though the people that we're interacting with have no meaning, as though there is no essential goodness and a genuine rational relationship, and one even of love, to be developed with the other people that we meet in our lives. We simply do not behave this way, and so instinctively we realize that to be objectifying women as mere sex objects, there is something wrong about it. We might find it very attractive and alluring and enticing at certain times, but when it's highlighted by something like, Jeffrey Epstein and his island, his seedy, dirty island, see, that's how it feels. We start to use words like dirty when we see, and in some cultures, an 8-year-old girl being married off to an 80-year-old man. We immediately recognize there's something very wrong here, and we call him a dirty old man, and we say, oh, that poor innocent young girl, oh, the poor thing. We talk about her like she's, some cornered little animal that's about to be devoured. And it is dirty. Why is it dirty? What is dirty about it? What's wrong with it? Well, ultimately, I have to come back to, and I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but it's those 4 principles which really do go together. If we're to have any sustainable nuclear families in a society, and we are to come together in any sort of sustainable fashion, then we must recognize that love is part of the equation. Love, marriage, sex, and procreation. The reason it's bad that those girls were there at Jeffrey Epstein's island is, well, yes, of course, they weren't there to get married and to spend the rest of their lives together happily. No, the girls were there to simply be used as objects. The men were, and forgive me for being a bit graphic here, the men were doing very little more than using those girls as a tool to simply masturbate. That's effectively all that was going on there. And likewise, with the 80-year-old man in my example, marrying this young 8-year-old girl, well, okay, one might be able to put together an argument to say, oh, well, love knows no bounds, age is only a number. But really, is this 80-year-old man so desperately in love with this 8-year-old girl that they simply must marry each other? Or is it that she has a very, very young body, youth is attractive to men, and he simply wants the use of her body to satisfy sexual urges? Love, Christian love, the love that we understand, because the three of us, frankly, have been enculturated in a Western context. When we think about love, we think about it in terms of there's an unconditional, self-sacrificial, not selfish aspect to this. Is there any of that sort of love in those examples? Clearly we know there's not, and it is repulsive to us. This is why we end up using words like dirty old man, dirty man. We're happy to have a label like paedophile thrown at Jeffrey Epstein, whether it's accurate or not. We just like that it's a negative word and it's being slapped on his face, and we want to see him punished, and we say good to ourselves when we see that he's died in prison, clearly not killed himself, clearly been killed by another, and we say it's a good thing when paedophiles are being murdered by other inmates who, despite having quite blackened souls themselves and having committed crimes, nevertheless they are so repulsed by the man who would simply use what they perceive to be a child as a sex object. They see that as behavior that is far too base to be allowed in society. It's far too damaging to everything that anyone would hold dear. It is what can I say, too insulting to anything that we would hold sacred. And so they kill these sorts of men in prison, and we all mutter to ourselves, "Oh well, good, he deserved it." That's how we feel about it. Whether that's right or wrong that we think and say those things is a different matter. But instinctively, that's how we feel about it. And I would say it is simply because that you have removed love from the equation. You have turned this girl into a sex object. And it is rife in our society. The feminists do it as well, Tim. The feminists are applying Christian principles, Christian sexual ethics, when they say, "Oh, don't objectify women." Well, why not? Why not? If we're to be materialists, then why not? Why is it so wrong that in the Japanese restaurant you can eat your steak off the naked body of a young girl and use her as a table, as an actual object? Why is that wrong? Without Christian ethics or some kind of, how can I put it, idealistic virtue ethics, without something like that, how can you really say that that's wrong?
I think an interesting aspect here that the feminists typically miss is that now you could say that they're down on their money, and so this is what they have to stoop to. But it is very true that young, attractive girls, some of them have very little concern with flaunting their physical prowess in return for money. This is why Donald Trump didn't find it particularly difficult to find any young, attractive women. Did they particularly care that the guy loved him? No, just gave him stuff. And I think this is something which is missed a lot of the time in feminist critiques, and some Christian ones as well. You see that it is solely the predatory male who is taking advantage of these poor naive girls, when in fact I think in many cases they know full well what they're doing and they enjoy the attention and the money. I think that cannot be discounted in these cases. But yes, when it comes to sort of massive age gaps, yes, you could consider that somewhat dirty. Although then the interesting question is, I think the love point is a good point. There was an interesting case was the RE teacher who was like 40 something, who then married his pupil. I think she was 16 or 18. He divorced his current wife. Now I don't know if they're still together. I don't remember. But interesting, that seemed to have some. Well, from what they claimed, at least, they did seem to love each other, which is, I think, an interesting case, because whilst it's not the sort of same as a dirty old man, those things tend to be frowned upon in general. Now, obviously, the fact that there was a teacher was an issue, and also that I think the guy divorced his wife. But it would be interesting. It does seem to be the case today that people think, if a guy is like in his 50 or whatever and marries like an 18 or a 19-year-old, that's somehow wrong and dirty, which seems odd from a historical point of view, because age gaps, I think age gaps were accepted more earlier. You have the half age plus 7, which tends to sort of go around a bit as an acceptable age gap difference. But I think the reason people tend to think it's dirty and wrong is probably for Rick's reason, although the question is, in practice, is it in all cases? And I think that's somewhat less easy to determine. Tim?
I think, Swithin, your comment about that some of them want it for money is obviously true. And this is where things this is where you get into sort of like 8D political theory chess here, where the political lines don't seem to make any sense, and the phenomena are very much convoluted. The battle lines are very much convoluted. Because you sort of have pro-sex feminists and you have anti-sex feminists, and of course you have pro-sex Christians and anti-sex Christians, and then you have pro-money and market Christians and anti-money and market Christians. So you have like 6 axes. You have 3 axes working, and you have lots of different positions on the respective respective things. And of course you get sort of like you get weird combination where you have like Paul Gottfried and Frankfurt School Marxists have the same view on prostitution and consumer sex. That would seem surprising by normal views, but by that view, that starts making more sense. Chronicles magazine and those things like that. So I do think your points about, but that certain women want it. And so to speak, and Michael Malice was sort of commenting hilariously that there's the WAP, this popular song is on the radio. He said that she every time that song gets played on the radio and sung by their little girls, soccer moms debate. Michael Malice was commenting that soccer moms debate joining Al Qaeda or ISIS. So yeah, there is. And this brings up this whole cuties controversy, where you have a show with child actors, which any normal definition of, you get into the weeds here of pornography or sexual objects. It's quite clear, and to a large extent. And this is where, before I get to Rick, I'm gonna pass this back to Swithin, because Swithin was somewhat interested in this topic. And you get people like Ted Cruz wondering if they're, the child actors were, child abuse, by even having them in the show. So Swithin, you have some questions and thoughts on this. What's your general take on the sort of cuties controversy regarding that? I mean, we can contextualize everything, but this was a quite interesting one. Swithin?
Well, I didn't watch it. I saw some clips for research purposes, although I didn't get Pete Townsend off. You may get that joke or you may not. So I mean, from what I read about it, it seems to be the case that the director wanted to show that sexualization of children was bad, but in so doing sexualized children. So yes, it didn't seem to be a particularly well thought through or savory show. Now, whether or not you can take what the director said at face value is another question, and whether or not it was an excuse to sexualize children and claim that you were against it whilst showing it. But the two interesting questions I think for me here was, is it child pornography? And Ted Cruz, I think, wanted someone to investigate whether it was. The pornography debate is an interesting when does art end and pornography start? This is sort of a notoriously difficult topic to determine a priori what the grounds were. But from at least the parts I saw, it would seem to be stretching the definition of pornography very widely. Now, interestingly, as an aside on that, the reason why I was interested, because I was fed up with people using the term child pornography and paedophile all the time. Because I was like, I don't even know what it means. There was a scale, but they now unfortunately use a more unclear scale. This was called the Copine scale in England, and it had various severities of child pornography on. And the level 1 was just actually compiling fully clothed pictures of children, but may indicate interest. And that actually was considered child pornography, which seems a very odd definition of child pornography, especially when it was just regular pictures of children just put together. So I always thought that was strange, and they still basically use that. I think basically for anything that people tend to think child pornography would be, I think it has to be like 4 or 5 on the Copine scale. I can't remember the precise. It's a Wikipedia Copine scale, and you can see what's well, fortunately you can't see it, but you can read what the scales are on there. So that big message. So yeah, it seems to be very odd to say that it's pornography. It clearly isn't, I don't think, unless you want to use the term very broadly. And then it raised my interest as when does bad parenting become abuse in a legal sense? Were these parents, should they be legally liable in some way for allowing their children to engage in this program? I mean, I think given the show, I think it's pretty clear that, yeah, it's a bad idea. You shouldn't have put your children to do that. But then the question arises, well, should you have any legal sanction? And the way I tend to try and view, I think you need a relatively high bar to intervene in what parents do with their children. And now I haven't fully worked out what I think that bar ought to be, but they were fully clothed. They simulated things. But was that so bad that it would warrant? Because again, the question was here as well is, what kind of sanctions can you put on the parents which don't then harm the children? This is always an issue if you try to intervene with what parents do with their children. So a related, though different matter entirely, there was a case recently in England in which a judge ordered 2 teenage children to be taken away from their mother on the grounds of neglect because they were too fat. Now, did the mother model and show good eating habits? No. But were the children going to be better off with their mother, or are they going to be better off not with their mother? That would seem to be a relevant factor here. And I think that's one of the reasons why I go, well, no, this shouldn't be child abuse in a sense of legally actionable, because it would still seem to be the case, I think, without any other information, that these girls would probably be better off still with their mother and father, hopefully, as well. So those were sort of the general thoughts that I had with respect to the Cuties thing when it was on a few months ago. I can't remember the precise date. Is that clear, Tim?
Yes, that's clear. Rik, what's your general take on this? I mean, this one of the interesting thing that interests me is the outrage about it, and also the outrage about Jeffrey Epstein as well. Now, again, this is sort of a meta-ethical point to a certain extent. In that regard, I generally agree with the sort of Nietzschean Sternite view. If Christianity is not true, it's some sort of like a world of no ethics or whatever it might make, right? Something like that. Where they precisely argue that, but I think you can get there pretty quickly. But one thing that interests me about this is the outrage, or the non-outrage and the defenses of it. So you get this is one of those news controversies that didn't go away. It sort of just floated around. It's an odd show to have. I'd be really interested to see what what would have been the take, even 50 years ago. I mean, there's a strange sort of decadent nature to the show, and there's also I don't think any historical feminist would call this liberation. Although maybe they would, So who knows? So Rick, what's your take on this controversy?
Well, Tim, you said, I wonder what the reaction would be 50 years ago. I think it's entirely possible that the people involved in making that film, not the children, of course, may have been lynched or something like that. And just to be perfectly blunt, I would not have stopped them. The outrage, why is there the outrage? Well, Swithin made an excellent point before when he said that, well, these young women who are, flaunting their bodies and, inviting men to use them as sexual objects in return for money. They should be treated, just as guilty, according to this Christian ethic, which informs so much of this conversation. And yes, I would agree. I would say again that women and children, again, they were considered to be capable of making their own decisions, and they had a moral duty before God to use their body and their lives and the people around them and the things around them, their property and all of this, to the glory of God, towards goodness, towards the common good. And yes, so I agree with Swithin. The women in the situation we were talking about before have a responsibility. That doesn't detract, of course, from them having a father over them. But what happens then is the father is told, look, you have a duty to be a good father. You do not have some right to kill and abuse your children. Again, you have a duty to raise your children to their good and towards the common good of the society around them. All the families that make up the rest of the society outside of your own home. And you see, that is where the outrage comes from, Tim. That's where it comes from, because where you have a group of people, the parents allowing their children to be involved in this cuties film, sending their daughters off to be scantily clad and to perform all sorts of highly sexualized dances, which, to someone who is attracted to children sexually, I can only suppose that, that would have to get them off, surely. And the producers, the director, all the people involved in the making of that film, what they were doing was presenting those girls, and we can properly say girls in this instance, as sexual objects on camera throughout a film. The fact that at the end of the film you say, oh, well, I guess being sexually objectified isn't that great, is about as helpful as a smoking kills sticker on a packet of cigarettes, frankly. It's useless. Everybody knows that already. We already know that it's wrong. The point that was that you had something where children were highly sexualized on camera. It's put on Netflix, and this is where the outrage comes from. Me as a father, other fathers who have this duty to be a good father and to raise their children for their own good, towards their own good and towards the common good. What you have is then flooding into your living room a particular message, which is, if young girls, if you are very sexualized and you perform very racy dances and try to entice men in the same way that those girls on Jeffrey Epstein's island did, you will be attractive. You look at these girls. on the screen. They've made it at their age. At that age, they have made it to the big screen through doing this sort of behavior. And of course, it goes without saying that Hollywood is full of sexual debauchery. This is how so many girls, women end up on screen. It's through, it's on Harvey Weinstein's couch. It's on the casting couch. And again, what do we dislike about this? Okay, it's because you are encouraging women or even children to think of themselves as sexual objects and to see that as being a good way ahead. To say that it has no effect on children is utter nonsense. It is utter nonsense. We are, all of us, enculturated by the families that we are born into, by the country and the general culture that we are born into, the language that we necessarily acquire as we are growing. We're enculturated in many different ways. And in no small part is this the case with television and with movies and with music. And this movie had it all. It had all of the highly sexualized music that is marketed towards, yes, children. And it had these young girls appearing to be very successful, appearing to be the way ahead, the way to get ahead, to get attention for oneself, performing those sorts of dances. And what's repulsive about it is that not only are these girls made into sexual objects at an age where it couldn't possibly be any worse, but it's that as a father, this is happening then to your daughter, whom I suppose, if you feel the same way as I do, you love very much and you want to protect, and you want to see them grow towards their optimum good. And you would love for them to live in a society which also cared about that sort of thing and also wanted to see their optimum good as well. That's where the outrage comes from. It's a societal thing. It's a familial thing. And I cannot imagine what outside of just money, the money involved, would have possessed those parents to allow them, their children, to be involved in the making of that film.
It is a strange event. It is a strange event. The outrage to me is always interesting because in some ways it reveals, Dallas Willard, or Christian apologist, it reveals the underlying Christian sympathies in much of our culture, for better or for worse. This even shows up with much of the outrage to like Donald Trump. Although with that it's tricky to a certain extent. I mean, people were critiquing that Donald Trump has 3 wives, and I was always like, is divorce a good thing or a bad thing? So if you're pro divorce, then this is the society you'll probably get. You'll get people like Trump having 3 wives. Now again, you can make the sort of, he did marry them all. So that's a huge thing, but most people don't have a standard. So the title of the episode is post. We don't have to stick to the precise title, but post-Christian. I would argue that in some ways we'll go back to sort of a a sort of more power-oriented culture, in the sense that might makes right. Arguably, that's what a post-Christian culture. It will have some sort of feministic tones, but I could argue that when they do have it, they're more power plays in that regard. So I think there's a certain extent that the post-Christian sexual ethics will be very little, or there'll be a return to the sort of the Roman system and the worst certain parts of the worst aspects, arguably, to some extent. If we truly get a post system, I would say that's be a full circle then. So Swithin, I think you could wrap it up if you want to pass it back to Rik for a comment, but that's fine. But what do you make of that, and any final comments with them?
Yeah, the current sexual ethics are odd. In one sense, is in California you have the affirmative consent law that kind of every stage of sort of foreplay, etc., has to sort of almost have a written contract. Can we go further? Yes. On the one hand, and then on the other hand, you have what seems to be, to some extent, a normalization of minor attracted persons at the same time. We seem to be going to sort of like, yes, consent but anybody can give consent. That is a possible way that things are going. Now that would make sense in the fact that children aren't cared about at all, particularly, which is obviously an abortion with this whole thing. So that's a potential route it's going, but I think it's obvious that the current sexual ethics are hugely schizophrenic in the West, and that's just unsurprising. Which way it will go is, I don't think, obvious. Rik, any final statements?
Well, I would tend to agree with a figure, albeit a fairly controversial one, a figure like Professor Edward Dutton. I think that where we see greater sexual libertinism, certainly we see this on Tinder. We see a smaller number of men attracting and having sexual relations with larger numbers of women. Now, Tim, of course, pointed out the example of Donald Trump. Bizarre, wasn't it? That he becomes the president, and yet Christians are making allowances for him, despite him, being a sort of King Solomon figure and, having all his women, having his affairs and that sort of thing. Because we kind of expect it from Donald Trump, being quite a high power, high testosterone figure. But then what we also saw was him using his position of responsibility to say, hold on a minute, look, this is actually what's good in society. Trying to encourage and to strengthen certain Christian ethics, especially sexual ethics, that sort of thing, in American society. And so that's why the Christians were making certain allowances. But where do we see things going generally? I think Tim has a good point, saying that we're heading towards more a sort of, perhaps you might argue, a more Nietzschean might makes right power situation, where the men who are, higher testosterone, never mind about their intelligence, they'd probably be lower intelligence, are going to be attracting more and more and more women. The bad boys, they're going to be attracting more women. They'll probably be having all sorts of children out of wedlock. And so we will start to see, as Professor Dutton believes, a polarization in society, where one part of society will be drifting off in this situation where you have a small number of men with a sort of harem and children, perhaps legitimate or not so, all around them, and these will tend to be lower IQ, higher testosterone. And of course, on the other side, you will see, the meek who inherit the earth. You will see conservative people having lots of children as they tend to, perhaps selecting more for intelligence and certain well-behaved, shall we say, more civil values in the men, and they will also make up a more significant bulk of society in the future. What that will look like, I have no idea.
Oh, final comment regarding that. It will be interesting to see if the differential birth rates of immigrant communities remain as high as they are, because that could well change the balance, especially if the Pakistani Bangladeshis, who currently have a particularly high birth rate, maintain that in England, the Hispanics possibly in the US. That could certainly change the culture as to how these things play out. I'd just like to now thank Rik for joining us again, and everyone who got to the end. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, any comments, criticisms, ideas for new shows, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com.